So hello, everyone. I'm going to keep my phone here so I know what time it is because I know you have an 11:30 thing. Uh, I was happy to hear that there are some sciencey people and some Lincoln people at the DAR, since that's the topic of the book is about Lincoln's sciencey side. So before I start that, though, I wanted to just to mention, even though I'm a former scientist and Lincoln guy, I actually grew up in a town in northeastern Massachusetts that billed itself as the birthplace of American independence. So I grew up with a very, let's say, a biased look at history in which everything had to do with the Revolutionary War and the colonial time period. And still, I somehow managed to get hooked on Abraham Lincoln. I will mention one more thing about DAR, though, and I don't know how many people in here know this, but if you go to Chicago, on the corner of like Lake and Wacker streets, there's a big stone monument and a plaque. And that plaque was put there in 1909 on the anniversary of Lincoln's birthday to celebrate and to commemorate, rather, the wigwam, which was a temporary building that was set up in Chicago in 1860 that nominated Lincoln for the Republican nomination and eventually the presidency. That plaque was designed, paid for, organized, and erected by DAR in 1909. So you guys have been all involved in Lincoln as well. Now, you probably know that, but I do want to say this is the Henry Clay chapter, right? You probably know that Lincoln thought of Henry Clay as his beau ideal of a statesman. It's the phrasing he used. And when Clay died in 1852, it was Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, who had a memorial for him and gave a eulogy to Henry Clay. And the reason why he liked Henry Clay is in part because Henry Clay was one of those people who, he wanted to hear from all different sides and try to find a path forward. So he was the one who came up with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. But he also, and Lincoln was like that. Lincoln wanted to find a path forward. He wanted to listen to different people and find a way to solve problems, not just scream about problems. The other reason he liked Henry Clay is that Henry Clay was the leader of the Whig Party for many, many years. And the Whig Party pushed, and Henry Clay pushed, the idea of internal improvements, which today we would call like infrastructure projects. And the idea was that governments, the state government and the federal government, could actually take an active role and play a role in trying to remove artificial burdens and better the conditions of all men by providing for the greater good that individuals couldn't do. And this was something that Lincoln was very, very much into. So I think probably some people would know that Lincoln, when he was 25 years old, was elected to the state legislature in Illinois. So here's a guy who grew up on a subsistence farm. He wasn't even a lawyer at that point, but he was good at meeting people. And he gets elected to the state legislature, and he's there for 4 terms, which is 8 years. And he becomes the Whig leader, pushing the Whig principles of this Henry Clay idea of what was called the American system of economic development, which was this idea that the government could play a role in helping to push the idea of developing technology and providing these infrastructure projects. So as a state legislator, Lincoln spent a lot of time pushing internal improvements, which at the time in Illinois, out on the frontier, and Illinois was about as far west as the United States was at that time. Things like infrastructure projects like roads, because all the roads basically, when it rained, they were mud slicks and you couldn't get through. Navigable rivers. So there were small rivers like the Sangamon River, which went through New Salem, where Lincoln was living at the time, that if you could clear them and deepen them and make them more navigable, you could get these steamships that were just really getting out west further up the river. And that would open up commerce to all of these people who were, rural farmers. Also, canals. He really pushed one canal in particular called the Illinois and Michigan Canal, the I&M Canal, which ran from Lake Michigan at Chicago down to the Illinois River, which then connected with the Mississippi River all the way down to New Orleans. And he saw this ahead of time, that the I&M Canal would do for Illinois what the Erie Canal had already done for New York, which was bring in huge amounts of new immigrants and new people, really increase the economy of the state and the region. And it would be the final connection of being able to get products across New England into New York, up through the Erie Canal, into the Great Lakes, through Illinois, and down into the Mississippi, and down to where New Orleans, which was the big commercial area at the time. And it did. And it's probably single-handedly the reason why Chicago went from a little village of a few hundred people to hundreds of thousands of people within like 20 years. It's just because of the I&M Canal. And you can still see parts of it out there now. The fourth piece of the internal improvements were railroads. And this was kind of epitomized a lot of the technological advancement that was going on during that time. And Lincoln ended up actually working for the railroads for quite a few years in his law profession. Now, the book itself talks about Lincoln and through his whole career, how he pushed this internal improvement idea and the development of technology and the increase of science and education throughout his political careers and also in his legal careers. But since I started talking about Henry Clay, I'm really kind of in the middle of the book. I mean, the big question is like, well, this is Lincoln. He grew up on a subsistence farm in Kentucky, and then Indiana, and eventually to Illinois. He had hardly any education. He says when he's running for president that the totality of his formal education was less than 1 year. So the first 21 years of his life, he went to school for a total of 1 year, and not all at once. It was like a week here, 2 weeks there, a month there, totaled less than 1 year of formal education. So it's like, well, how much could he learn, right? He says, well, I learned reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of three, which ciphering, rule of three is like a ratio, simple ratio. But then when you start digging into it, which is what I did for the book, you realize he was really underselling himself. He was writing this when he was running for president, and he had by this time had this rail splitter kind of mystique, and so he didn't want to really say that he was all that educated, and he wasn't. And formally, he had less than 1 year. He didn't have much education. When you dig into it, you can see that he actually had quite a bit more self-education and understanding of things like science and technology than he himself gave himself credit for, and that historians have given him credit for because they haven't dug into these issues. So, for example, he says that, well, I learned, reading, writing, and ciphering for the rule of three, but I studied front to back Pike's arithmetic. So, well, let me see what's in Pike's arithmetic, and went back and looked at the edition from that time period. And it's wonderful. You can get all the stuff online now. It's great. Although I did find some in the libraries too. You read through it and it's like, well, wait a second. There's a rule of three, the single rule of three, a double rule of three, an inverse rule of three. There's the usual subtraction, addition, multiplication, division. But when you look at the sum sheets he wrote, you can see that he actually did much more complicated, large number, long division. And back then, you get to the bottom of this long division, and you have to back calculate it to proof it to get back to the original numbers, which I actually did as a little kid too. Pretty sure they don't do that anymore. So he was doing all of that, but he was also learning about discount rate calculations, interest rate calculations. He was converting between fractions and decimals and whole numbers. And I used a lot of half numbers back then, half cents and half pence. So we had to convert from British weights and measures to American weights and measures, which were used interchangeably, and the same for currency. So there's a lot more he was doing. He also, when he was in New Salem, he worked part-time as a surveyor. And a surveyor, you don't just look through a compass on a stick and pull out a chain. You have to learn some math. So he studied Flint and a little bit of Gibson. So looked at those books. Well, they're surveying texts, and they're actually quite thick, and they have a lot of information in it. And you realize he's learning geometry, which is the science of shapes, and he's learning trigonometry. People took trigonometry in high school or college. So that's, sines, cosines, secants, tangents. I mean, it's stuff that people hate today, but, they were done. Today, you just punch it in your calculator or a computer. But back then, you had to calculate all of these things. So that science of angles was critical to surveying. He also, when he was in Congress, he taught himself Euclid geometry, which is the 6 principles of Euclid geometry, which he mastered, which most people didn't. And that's about logic as much as it is about geometry. Of course, he taught himself the law from just reading. He taught himself the law. He actually knew, once I dug into it, he knew a lot about astronomy. He knew a lot of physics. When you read some of the things that he wrote in some letters, and one I particularly like is he wrote a snippet, like a short description of his visit to Niagara Falls. And when you read that, you say, wait a second, this guy knows, he understands the hydrology of the falls. He understands the circulation of the water back up into the atmosphere and back down again as rain. He calculates out the drainage of Niagara Falls and gets it like almost exactly right. He realizes that the falls have moved back from where they originally were. Where you see now where the fall is, that's way back. It's like 7 miles back from where it originally was. Even in Lincoln's time, it was several miles back. And he realizes that, well, this is eroding. So he understands the concept of erosion. They're talking about some mammoths and mastodons roaming the earth when this thing started going back, which is paleontology, because we only know about them from bones. And he calculates like the age of the earth, which is really the age of how long this Niagara Falls has been working its way backwards, which is the ice age, since the ice age. He calculates that, so it's about 15,000 years, which is almost exactly right. So he was able to do a lot more than people give him credit for. So I talk about that, and I talk about his schooling. He learned a lot of science as a farmer, even. My father grew up on a subsistence farm. I worked on the farm when I was a kid. You learn a lot of science, actually, passed down through your parents. Agronomy. You don't just throw seeds into the soil and just hope that something grows. You have to understand soil nutrition, hydrology, agronomy. When they moved from Kentucky to Indiana, they moved into an unbroken forest. Right, you can't grow crops in an unbroken forest. So you had to learn about forest ecology. How to get the trees out of there. They have different kinds of roots which affect that. There's big trees, little trees, hardwood trees, softwood trees, drier trees, and sappy trees like pines. There's tall, straight trees and trees that branch out very quickly. Obviously, you need to figure out all of that and how to get rid of them. But also, what do you do with them? They didn't just throw them away; they used them. So there's some of them they used for firewood to cook food. Some of them they used for fence rails, which Lincoln became rail splitter. And some of them you had to figure out how to take all these round trees and build a log cabin so it doesn't leak every time it rains. So there's some civil engineering he's learning as well. So there's a lot he's picking up along the way, and he implements these in his science and in his political career and also his law career. The law career, I'll just mention really quickly. He very early on he's out on the frontier. He's doing a lot of title cases where there were arguments over, do you own that land that you just sold me or not? There were also divorce cases and things like that. But as he got older and more into his practice, he was doing more and more patent and technology cases. So there's a Manny McCormick Reaper trial. It's very famous, where he looked at these mechanical devices to help you harvest the grain. And that was just part of the technological advances that were being made. And he was doing that. He did, there was an Effie Afton trial, which was steamships versus railroads. Steamship ran into a railroad bridge, the very first railroad bridge across the Mississippi River, 2 weeks after they finished building it. Crashed into it, caught fire, destroyed the steamship, damaged the bridge. You couldn't run any trains over it. And then the steamship sues the bridge manufacturer and the trains, the railroad companies, and say, you can't build those are obstructions. Lincoln had already been working for the railroads by this time, and he gets hired by the railroads from the bridge manufacturers, goes out there. He had also, by this time, actually been a pilot on river steamships. So he knew how they worked and how to steer them and everything. So he goes out and he measures the speed of the boat, the flow rate of the water coming underneath the bridge, any eddies created by it, the angles. He gets ready to dig deep into the engineering. He has to understand the math and everything in order to do that. And then he convinces most of the jury that, yeah, the bridge is not an obstruction. In fact, it looks like either through negligence or intent, the steamship caused this accident. Bottom line is they're able to rebuild the bridge, run trains across it, and it completely changes the commercial environment of the United States. Now, especially in the North, you get much easier to run trains cross country into all this new land we would get a few years later, all the way to the West Coast. We had the Transcontinental Railroad, which Lincoln actually, as president, signed into law and created. So there's a lot of things like that he did to promote the idea of science, technology, and education. Now, I'm just really hitting the surface there. I'll mention real quick, because I know we're going to run out of time real quick, but I'll mention real quick a couple of things. He is the only president with a patent, which some of you may have known. Even to this day, no other president has ever had a patent. And it's for a system for getting ships over shoals, low areas. They get stuck in low water. And it incorporates the Archimedes principle, which is physics. It's buoyancy and it's displacement. And he didn't know the Archimedes principle, but he understands conceptually the idea of buoyancy and displacement, and design that into his system where he can inflate these little bladders to raise the ship. So he still is the only one with a patent. Later on, just before he ran for president, he started giving a set of lectures called Discoveries and Inventions, where he traced the growth of technology through the development of clothing and one side and communication and another. Really dug into this and understood not only our technological development over time, starting with Adam and Eve. He went from there all the way to present day. He not only understood that, he understood the importance of that. And so he talks about that. And then, of course, when he gets to be president, right after he's sworn in, the war starts. 7 states had already seceded before he even was inaugurated. But then the war starts and he's at war. And people quickly find out that he's a techie guy. He likes this new stuff. Whereas the military likes to keep things simple. So just give me 1 million muskets. I can teach people how to use that. They're simple. They're not going to get, they're not too complicated. They don't have to have a lot of supply chains for it. Lincoln was like, yeah, but what about this new weapon that this guy just brought in that has 7 shells in a cartridge that you can put into the gun and shoot 7 shells really quickly? And he had to fight with the military because they're like, it's too complicated. It won't work, whatever. So he was really pushing the military into incorporating more and more technology during the war. He also understood, because he had worked with the railroads, he understood the importance of railroads. He was instrumental to getting the ironclad monitor built just in time. And he was the first president to use the telegraph during wartime. In fact, anybody to use the telegraph in wartime worldwide. It hadn't been invented that long before. In 1844 was the first time. And it was the first time used in war. So for the first time, the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy could actually communicate with his generals in the field, which didn't happen before. He told generals, go win us the war, and then you hope they did. You didn't really hear much from him. So he understood that and understood the concept of how to use science technology to help win the war. And it's way more complicated than that, but I don't have time for that. I'll mention one more thing and then I have to stop. Yeah, I know I'm at the end. You cut my time shorter than even I thought. So I talked, Sophia reached out to me after I gave a talk at the White House Historical Association in early June about how Lincoln institutionalized science and technology in the federal government, which federal government didn't have much science technology support until the Civil War and Lincoln. So I gave a talk at this White House Historical Association and talked about how Lincoln pushed the idea of things like the bringing science, having the Department of Agriculture with science, National Academy of Sciences he started. He was the first one to put aside land, became Yosemite National Park. It was basically an Office of Technology Assessment for Weaponry. All of these things he pushed through and signed, and there was a few other things too. So you can go back to the White House Historical Association website. They have the video of that talk from early, I think it was June 6th, something like that. Or you can go to my website, which is on the back of those cards, or just go davidjkent-writer.com. And on that site, on the media tab, you can look back and click on all sorts of videos and podcasts and radio programs and things that I've been doing related to different aspects of the book. And I usually talk about different aspects in each one. So I will stop there. And if you have questions or if you have time, I'll take them.
So I'm really glad that you mentioned the White House Historical Association presentation, because I will be posting that to our social media so everyone can watch it at their leisure. It is the extended version of this. I primarily want to thank you for really expanding everyone's knowledge and appreciation of Abraham Lincoln and his legacy. I think the work you're doing is incredibly important to that. And I know that with the many history buffs and scientists we have in this room, that they were really excited to have you today. So I want to thank you very much. And I would like to present you with this and our appreciation for your work and for sharing your time with us today.